Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. I spoke yesterday about purpose and its necessary and central role in organisational and societal futures. Today, I'd like to share some thoughts on another subject that's probably taking up most of people's time right now, and that's change. So I'd like to share some thoughts on that. Tomorrow, I'm doing another talk, and I hope to bring ideas around purpose and ideas around change together to talk about Oxfordshire. So but that's for tomorrow. Now that we're all through the initial shock to our systems and the system, if we can call it that, or the many systems out there, and have begun to adapt to our different interim normals, with all the attendant and varying amounts of confusion and fear and possibly grief, some of us have started to think and talk about the future, and others have already moved forward and have moved towards the future. But some can't wait to get back to normal. Some can't wait to see a new or a next normal, mostly in some kind of utopian way, as far as I can see. Some can't bear the idea of any change, and others want to see massive change. And most are falling between two stools and want both. Big change here and no change there, back to normal or moving towards a new normal. And of course, all of these are ideal states, or at least that's how I see them. And they're impossible to achieve, and they're utterly wrong because you can't achieve them. And I'm not sure which is more wrong, but I hate the idea of going back to normal almost as much as I hate the idea of finding a new normal. Normal was never normal anyway, and it never will be. And normal doesn't also necessarily mean that it's right. If something's normal, it may not be right either. In fact, normal was becoming increasingly abnormal in the years before COVID, because of the increasing rapidity of change in technology and innovation, social issues recognition, and all sorts of other things, but more viscerally in people's awareness of and growing concerned about the way things are. It's as sort of benign as that. It's just how things are, and that's what we have to accept. Normal, past, present, and future, suggests a steady state over time, something that we can get used to and rely on. And I'm not sure this can ever happen, or even if it's right for it to happen. So what are our alternatives when the only certainty for all of us, as I see it in the future, is change, welcomed or unwelcomed change? And in my experience, and I have 35 years experience of building purpose and strategic change programs for clients all over the world, organisations embark on two types of change, really. So I'm just going to briefly talk about what those two types are as I can see them. There's one that I like to call the herding cats approach to change. And it's led by a principle, and it's a phrase that I love. At one point, I thought I may have invented this quote myself, but apparently I didn't, which is that people always love the phrase, that I love the phrase, people only fear two things, change and the way things are. And if you follow that, we're all fucked, because there is nothing else that we can do other than live in a change state or the way things are. And it perfectly sums up a human dichotomy and the tensions between keeping things as they are on the one side or changing them on the other. Hopefully the better. And the key word here is hopefully. It's sad that we would want to hope about either affecting change or keeping things the same. But two things are clear. Each of these states are imperfect, and they're opposing forces, and falling between them, making change and keeping things the same, without reconciling them, is usually profoundly damaging when you fail at both. Sitting on the fence, as we all have probably discovered in our lives, can be really uncomfortable. So personally, I celebrate and am excited by change. Most of my career has been spent in creating strategic change, as I said earlier. But for businesses and organisations, iterative change, a bit here and a bit there, has always been hard, is often ill-conceived, often has herding cats as its primary planning approach, and almost always ends with underwhelming positive outcomes, if any at all. Tinkering the edges might improve a bit in one area, but it almost always upsets things in others. The loss is almost always greater than the gain. Change, when conducted piecemeal in these ways, within the context of endemic fear of and resistance to change, often fear of change and resistance to change by the very people who are actually charged with leading and implementing change, and set within a culture that has been nurtured to maintain systemic and binary and hierarchical steady states and balance, otherwise known as the normal, is nigh on impossible and inextricably leads to failure. And I think McKinsey's produced some stats a few years ago. There are a number of numbers floating about, but almost, I think 77% that sort of order of things, of organisational redesigns fail. The mixed messages about change alone in this sort of herding cats model are guaranteed to create initial confusion and doubt and expanding inertia and eventual resistance to change, or worse, apathy, and then fatalism. So we have fear, and we have failure, and we have fatalism. Continuous piecemeal change, another way perhaps of describing the reality rather than the definition of agile organisations, when set within a culture and conduct that has not been carefully aligned to change and guided by strategies, can't believe I've just done some things there, but that fail to bind change elements together over time because they aren't really strategies, leads to change fatigue. And we see this often in organisations. Overlaid on all this, change that is embarked on without clarity of purpose, going back to that word again that's been spoken about a lot over the last couple of days, or there is an unplanned or poorly conceived knee-jerk reaction to change elsewhere that in turn causes a crisis, aka panic, aka headless chicken mode, is doomed to failure. Worse still, having failed once, the opportunities to create effective future change are eroded by a loss of confidence before they've even begun. And so organisations revert back to resistance to change mode, often with chastened leaders, sceptical teams and individuals, fearful change agents, people like me who walk into these things nervously, and if an attitude that is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's a culture that can become endemic across an organisation. So fear, failure, fatalism and fatigue are not great inspirers of anything at all, let alone change. The problems with poorly planned iterative changes that are not rooted in substantial reason and strategic vision are many and various. But the real biggie is that people don't really like change. Most people will do almost anything to avoid it. And even when engaged in it, most try to minimise it and keep it as close to their current unchanged states as possible. The default position is to go through the motions of change with as little fuss or disruption or cost in time and treasure as possible. This is perhaps why we hear the phrase back to normal so much. This change lark will blow over and then we can revert back to how things always were. That's said a lot, I think, in organisations everywhere. So far, so bad. Herding cats always ends in tears, unless you're the cat. So what about another way of creating change? It's what I call the sweeping grand gesture approach to change. Over the last few years, lots of earnest and creative, far-sighted and thoughtful people have been looking at the world with increasing concern, but with their fine minds firmly focused on a systemically changed future. Discussion and debate has looked at really massive change issues like society, democracy, globalisation, capitalism, agency, inclusivity, citizenship, I could go on and on, work, government, policy, all sorts of things. Within these big concepts or grand strategies, there have been some really big and mind-bending philosophical recurring themes, equally far-reaching and deeply considered, and very, very relevant. What is the role of business? What is its purpose? How can equality and agency be better created for everyone? What should we teach our children for the future? Have we left the consumer age and entered the citizen age? How will work change? How can we ensure more effective and sustainable social issues resolution? What is self? How can we move from individualism to an interdependent society? And what is our role and contribution and value? And to who? And about what? The challenge until very recently has been that although these thoughts, questions and ideas have been very much in the public domain, you can see them all over everywhere, and various opinions, research and discourses have been widely published, very few actual, real people have been engaged in this or even been aware. In the business community, for instance, the concept of corporate purpose as being single-mindedly about profits and shareholder value has been increasingly challenged. Should business have higher purpose, as Professor Colin Mayer describes, to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and in the process, the corporation produces profit? Where does a passing nod to CSR change into a primary focus on business as a force for good, the common good perhaps? What is the tipping point where business needs to take this approach more seriously or risk losing the force for good competitive battle and the hearts and minds of increasingly aware and cynical consumers? Some enlightened and capable business leaders with opportunity to make radical change, and people around them who get why they should, have addressed these issues and begun to reimagine their entire organisations. Others have tried and failed through poor vision or strategy setting and planning, communication, that's always a really big one, and implementation. Others haven't even tried because they either don't care or they do, but they don't see how they can change. The vast majority of business leaders, though, for one reason or another, haven't or can't even begin to see how their business and propositions can possibly contribute in these ways, over and above trying to make profit. These businesses are out of scope, or at least they have been traditionally, because they're struggling just to make money at all, let alone profit, let alone more than profits. They may not even be aware of the discussions in the first place. One thing is certain, though. For every business or organisation that has the perfect blend of enlightened leadership, opportunities to change, reasons to change, visionary ambition, and the sheer drive to compel everyone around them to create a new future, there are thousands of others who can't or won't even engage in the possibility, or who have tried, in the piecemeal herding cats way that I described earlier, in an unfocused and poorly implemented way. They fail, and they possibly never try again, and they leave a legacy of fear, fatalism, failure, and fatigue. The reality is that no matter how well-intentioned, sweeping grand gestures, wholesale change, big vision thinking, and a desire to be more purposeful rarely lead to effective, sustained, and rewarding change alone. So what the fuck are we going to do about that then? It's a good question, and there aren't really any simple answers. Iterative change, herding cats in the margins, where the primary aim is to maintain the steady state as much as possible, and where vision and purpose are considered as marketing tools. Strategy is considered as a luxury if it's considered at all. Future planning is something to be done if and when there is a downturn in actual doing, and culture is something that just happens, is bound to fail, with all the outcomes described above. And you'll note they're all F words too. I'm not going to say any more swear words just now because I'm going to run out of money in my bank account if I do. Grand sweeping gestures, ignored by many, dreamt about by some, affected by very few, and affected well by 1 in a million are great. But the bigger the change, the harder the fall, unless held up by systemic change planning and rigour and total commitment, and above all, substantive compelling reasons. These are hard to do and they're harder to sustain. The good news is that all the really big thinking described here, but is slowly but surely moving to the centre. It was starting to be thought about by more leaders and more doers and more mavericks, but mostly it was starting to be seriously considered by us, ordinary people, workers, consumers, customers, fans, voters, aka citizens, aka human beings. Increasingly, ordinary people like us were beginning to ask their own questions in their own ways, in their own homes, workplaces, and communities. Change was beginning to move from the rarefied atmosphere of the thinkers and into the oxygen-filled rooms of the doers. Groundswell was starting to be created. Movements for change were creaking into the mainstream. People were beginning to challenge many of the steady states of life as we knew them. Many were beginning to question themselves, their place and purpose, their value and their role and their work. While some chose to ignore these disquieting and destabilising thoughts, increasing numbers of people decided to do something about it. Resistance to change, fear of change, and the sheer daunting nature of change were beginning to be overcome in small, often unplanned ways. And then COVID hit, and the shit really hit the fan. For better or worse, we've all been making unplanned and incremental changes in the last few weeks. We've all been herding cats. I fell apart at the seams at the very beginning of all this. I didn't think I had a place or a role anymore. Similarly, we've all heard much conjecture or ideas or grand sweeping gestures about what the future will look like. But the truth is, we really don't know. We certainly don't know what the new or the next normal will look like. And I really hope it doesn't look like anything. I don't want normal, because normal suggests something we can engineer and then sort of forget about and bask in our own hubris and get on with our daily lives and ignore until the next big need to change hits, and then we go through it all again. Normal is at best only good if we happen to be able to enjoy it. Normal is really bad if we're suffering through it or see it as damaging. My preference, therefore, is for businesses and organisations, leaders, and most importantly, ordinary people, is that we forget normal and we start to consider everything from society to our ordinary role in it as work in progress or a constant state of flux. Let us assume that things will never be perfect or right, but by creating a balance between grand sweeping gestures and the pursuit of purposeful aims, and carefully planned iterative changes to meet those aims, where equity and inclusivity through agency, actual agency, changed approaches to traditional leadership and binary hierarchies, and a real understanding of what an interdependent society and our roles within it might look like, we might just start to actually work together fully and find that change done well is something to be celebrated and valued, not feared. Maybe then we won't need to fear either change or the way things are. Maybe we won't have to rely on others to make change happen. Maybe we can do it ourselves, together, as businesses and social enterprises and charities and foundations and governments and everything else. After all these entities are made up of human beings who are all citizens. You never know, if we can overcome fear, we might just start enjoying change.